is to introduce to you Andy Knight. Andy and I go back for, well, more years than either of us are going to admit to, but about 25. And we've been working on United Nations research all this time. I'm not going to read to you because it's all, you have, Nancy's done a magnificent job. You have in your program, you have the list of every speaker, you have their CVs, and you have a summary of what they're going to say. I just want to say this about our friend Andy Knight. First of all, along with Joe's book, I think Andy has probably written the most significant factual and theoretical analyses of the United Nations. He's done two extraordinarily instructive books about the United Nations and what needs to be reformed in it and how it should be brought about. So that is the type of person and leader, and speaker and thinker that we're going to hear from now. Andy, your floor.
Thank you very much, John. And I want to say all protocols observed, but I am now the director of a diplomatic center in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are told that you shouldn't do that. That's not protocol. So let me just say, first of all, to Eric Schwartz, Bill Pace, who's here, Joe Schwartzberg, and John Trent, Robert Johansson, it's good to see you, Bob, and to the speakers, students, media, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wonderful privilege and pleasure for me to be here in Minnesota. It's probably my second visit to Minnesota. And it's wonderful to be able to meet Joe in person. I recall being the editor, one of the editors of Global Governance Journal some years ago, between 2000 and 2005. And I recall getting some manuscripts from Joe and having to battle with some of my editors, my co-editors, about whether or not we were going to publish these manuscripts, because they were very much forward-looking, way ahead of his time in some ways, and writing very differently from most of the scholars in international organization that we had known. And I still remember being excited by this fresh approach to reform, adaptation, transformation of the United Nations system, because I was one of those young students at the time. John remembers a young student who was doing work on the United Nations when nobody else was doing work on the United Nations at that time. And so it wasn't a matter of pre-science. It was really more a matter of being stubborn, because my supervisor had said to me when I first started my PhD that I should do my work on East-West security regimes. And this happened just before the end of the Cold War. Then the Cold War happened, the Berlin Wall came down, all the players in East-West security changed, and I was, I guess, the only graduate student standing, working on my work on the United Nations, reform the United Nations, and that work became very important for the university at York University in Toronto, to the point where I got my first job before finishing my PhD dissertation. And so I think I lucked out in some ways by being stubborn. I wanted to stick with what I wanted to do, which is try to understand the UN better and try to understand ways of changing that organization. So my lifelong work has been on the United Nations, and furthermore on global governance beyond the United Nations. So my talk today is on it's very simple: time for a new global governance paradigm. And for those of you who understand the trends that have taken place since the end of the Cold War, you will realize that our world has seemingly become increasingly ungovernable since the end of the Cold War. The post-Cold War period has been marked by the intensification of globalization, with its attendant negative effects. It has also been characterized as an era that has ushered in a new world disorder. Yet, we have institutions of global governance that are supposed to manage and address the global problems we face and to steer us into a future that is more peaceful, more stable, more equitable, more just, more sustainable, and more prosperous. The target set for the 2015 Millennium Development Goals and the concomitant 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and its 169 targets certainly offer a normative desire and strengthen global solidarity on the part of the member states of the United Nations to try to establish some semblance of global governance via the institutions and agencies of this 70-year-old organization. I argue here that the extant institutions of global governance, including but not limited to the United Nations, are more or less decisions frozen in time, created at an historical juncture when sovereignty-bound entities reigned supreme. Today, those institutions are being forced to operate in a very turbulent, complex, interdependent, and I use the term intermestic era, in which sovereignty-free and sovereignty-bound actors compete and jostle for positions on the global stage. The problem is that under the ellipsoidal glare of an intensity of the spotlight, post-World War II institutions of global governance are revealing themselves to be defective, inefficient, ineffective, and largely irrelevant in the 21st century. The crisis of global governance at this point in our history has triggered an intense and growing interest in governance at all levels. And I argue here that the time is ripe for a reconceptualization of global governance and for the construction of a new global governance paradigm. To do so, I recommend a shift from problem-solving theorizing to an embrace of a critical theory approach that stands outside prevailing understandings of what global governance has come to mean. In the Gramscian tradition of Robert Cox, who was one of my mentors and a great friend, I propose that we empirically examine the patchwork concoction that we call the global governance architecture and describe what the late James Rosenow termed as the post-Cold War fragmegrative and complex environment within which the architecture was constructed. Only then will it become clear that the time has come for us to focus not so much on reform and adaptation of those institutions, but rather on the transformation of the very conception and raison d'etre of global governance in the absence of world government. This, of course, requires a Kuhnian paradigm shift away from the state-centric idea of international, anarchic, and hierarchic governance to one that embodies notions of hierarchic, multi-centric authority and subsidiarity arrangements that are more conducive to self-organizing steering of multiple and multi-level agencies, state and non-state, public and private, which can be operationally autonomous yet structurally coupled due to their mutual interdependence. So let me just give you a sketch of the new world disorder in which these international organizations have to operate. Global politics in the early part of the 21st century has been dominated by gruesome acts of rampant terrorism, multilateral and unilateral reprisals to those acts of terrorism, global economic downturns, mounting civil strife, war crimes and crimes against humanity. This turbulent time reveals cracks, if not a total breakdown, in the prevailing global order, and has led to ever louder demands for the establishment of new institutions of governance to replace or at least complement the worn existing ones we have today. This is not the first time, of course, in world history when prevailing systems of governance have been challenged by pronounced structural forces for change. In past centuries, there have been repeated attempts at reforming existing institutions or creating new ones to tame the conflicts and disorders of those periods. More recently, during the immediate post-Cold War period, we witnessed the removal of some of the structural and ideological underpinnings of superpower conflict that characterized the last half of the previous century. And apart from relaxing global tensions, this changed structural condition ostensibly reduced the major security threat that the world was facing during the Cold War. That is the threat of nuclear war between the two heavily armed military camps that could have resulted in mutual assured destruction, what we call MAD. By the end of that precarious balance of power between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, it created a climate of uncertainty. But the end of that precarious balance created a climate of insecurity and uncertainty, with the rise of a number of civil conflicts and the spread of internecine violence in places like Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, and the former Yugoslavia. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been approximately 93 conflicts around the world in which over 5.5 million people were killed, 75% of those being civilians. And almost all of these conflicts were intrastate conflicts, thus explaining the disproportionate number of civilian casualties. This immediate post-Cold War period was also characterized by an exponential increase in transnational challenges. Some of these challenges included the horizontal proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the spike in the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, the spread of hate material and ideologies of hate, the increased consumption of pornography and sexual slavery, computer hacking and cyber theft, an increase in drug trafficking, trafficking in women and children, an increase in mass migration and the number of internally displaced persons, forced labor and organized criminal activity, financial market collapses, piracy on the high seas, especially in Malacca Straits and off the coast of Somalia and Nigeria, and the circumvention of national regulatory policies and taxes. Clearly, the national institutions that are supposed to express people's preferences in these matters are increasingly ineffective in coping with them. The post-World War II institutions that were designed to address the interstate issues were all of a sudden showing signs at the end of the Cold War era, and not only of ineffectiveness, but also of irrelevance. And many of the regional institutions did not fare any better. This raised the alert among scholars and practitioners of the need for a new global governance architecture that would effectively deal with transnational and intermestic issues, those issues that fall between the cracks sometimes, between the international and the domestic. The debacle in Somalia, the Rwandan genocide, the at times indiscriminate but politically motivated slaughter in the DRC, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, and the continued violence in other places such as the Middle East, in Asia, in Chechnya, and Latin America, all indicated a persistent adherence to a culture of violence as hypernationalism, terrorism, and long-suppressed ethnic conflicts reared their ugly heads in the latter part of the 20th century. Other human tragedies and gross human rights violations occurred in so-called failed states, where the degeneration or total absence of national governance structures meant that civilians were particularly vulnerable to acts of violence, kidnappings and murders, sexual assaults. Millions of innocent people were fleeing violence and became refugees and displaced persons, and thousands of children have been and continue to be recruited as child soldiers by both governments and rebel forces. The destruction of national infrastructures and of governmental and societal institutions worth billions of dollars was due at times to internecine violence, but also at other times to natural and man-made disasters during this immediate post-Cold War period. Again, national governments found it very difficult to address the spillover problems associated with international conflicts, internal conflicts, and humanitarian disasters, And similarly, international governmental organizations like the United Nations system and regional intergovernmental bodies like the African Union were struggling to cope with the increasingly transnational and intermestic nature of these problems. And in general, the narrative I just painted in this panoramic view of what can only be referred to as the New World Disorder, an environment of turbulence and flux, fragmentation, disequilibrium, and uncertainty, which cries out for the establishment of novel forms of governance, activities, and institutions, since the existing one seems ineffectual. But this picture is only part of the puzzle, and there are other integrative and fragmentary forces at work colliding, which are putting pressure on the existing international governance architecture. So I want to sort of describe some of those issues, particularly looking at the complex interdependence and globalization forces that have caused us to rethink global governance. The late James Rosnow alerted us to some of the ways in which the advent of dynamic technologies has resulted in the decline of distances in the modern world. He used what he calls the term distant proximities to describe that. Technological advances in communications and transportation have resulted in an increase in the level of complex interdependence, a term that many of you would know was coined by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye. Modern communications in the forms of newspapers, radio, television, telephones, fax machines, computers, the internet, email, social media, etc., appear to be producing contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, uniting, but also fragmenting audiences, exacerbating social cleavages, as well as bringing together disparate groups, heightening existing antagonisms, as well as providing means through which such friction can be resolved, eroding national boundaries, as well as propelling ultranationalist fervor, increasing political cynicism, as well as raising the level of civil society's political consciousness. Individual citizens have been empowered as the result of the media's influence. At the same time, because of their adeptness with the utilization of modern communication systems, state leaders have also been empowered vis-a-vis civil society. Modern transportation has allowed people of formerly distant societies to interact more frequently. It acts as a conduit for bringing individuals from different countries with similar interests together, but it also serves to facilitate transnational criminal activity. The overall effect of the above has been the shrinkage in the social, political, economic, and cultural distances, and as a consequence of this phenomenon, formerly dense and opaque frontiers are being dissolved, thus breaking down the Westphalian notion of the inside versus the outside. National boundaries are no longer able to divide friend from foe. Indeed, the technological revolution has a potential for creating in the minds of people around the world a sense of global citizenship, which could result eventually in the transfer of individuals' loyalties from sovereignty-bound to sovereignty-free governance bodies. And this changing relationship between public and private spheres and the virtual collapse of the dividing line separating the domestic from the external environment suggests a fluid but closely integrated global system substantially at odds with the notion of a fragmented system of nationally delineated sovereign states. However, it does not yet mean that global civil society has been formed, although one can argue that such an entity is in the process of being established, as I will show later. Now, aided by the technological revolution, globalization has contributed to global space and time shrinkage. The globalization of trade, production, and finance has resulted in a marked decline in some governments' ability to control the sectors that has challenged the traditional concept of state sovereignty. It has also expanded the number of players that can be involved in the multilateral process. The globalization movement and the seemingly paradoxical adherence to territorialism are two concepts of world order that stand in conflict but are also interrelated. The globalization of economic processes requires the backing of territorially based state power to enforce its rules. But post-Fordism, the new pattern of social organization of production, that is congruent with the globalization phenomenon implicitly contradicts the lingering territorial principle that has long been identified with Fordism. The results of post-Fordist production have been, among other things, the dismantling of the welfare state, the diminishing of the strength of organized labor, but it also had the effect of increasingly fragmenting power in the world system, providing fodder for the possibility of culturally diverse alternatives to global homogenization. If Robert Cox is right, we can see how this dialectical double movement, as he calls it, of the globalization process can alter the relationship people have with the political arena, and how it can eventually create a reaction leading to what James Rosnow has termed explosive subgroupism. James Rosnow has a way of sort of creating new language in political science. And I think it sort of describes, reflects basically what he was trying to say. This explosive subgroupism is one example of that, as seen in many of the anti-globalization process movements that you've witnessed over the last couple of decades. This subgroupism has already spurred the revival of what can be called civilizational studies that are further unearthing anti-globalization movements and ideas and a bottom-up form of governance. There are other ways in which globalization is facilitating the dissolution of formerly dense and opaque boundaries. For example, economic globalization has resulted in a global division of labor that hardly respects state boundaries and sovereignty. It has to a large extent been responsible for the feminization of work, particularly in the developing world, which penetrates traditional gender boundaries. The international movement of capital via electronic transfers has also had a major effect on the relocation of authority and power structures. And similarly, media globalization via satellite, new networks like CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and the internet superhighway has all contributed to the diffusion of power. Its impact raises the possibility of the development of a truly global society, something that could again transform the nature of multilateralism and the way we view governance. Finally, another challenge to the traditional notion of multilateralism and governance has to do with the transnational and intermestic issues. For example, environmental pollution, global warming, currency crises, the drug trade, human rights degeneration, terrorism, the AIDS, SARS, Ebola crises, non-communicable diseases, refugee flows, gender inequality, etc. These issues, by their very nature, all impel cooperation on a transnational scale, since in the majority of cases they cannot be resolved by individual states acting on their own, or even bilaterally for that matter. So multi-centric actors have pursued, has actually pushed many of these issues onto the global agenda. The impact of the multiplication of transnational and intermestic issues is that the state-centric, multilateral, intergovernmental institutions have had to find ways of acknowledging, if not embracing, the input of NGOs and other civil societal actors who formerly would not have been considered important players on the international stage. The alternative of not embracing these entities could very well be the establishment of parallel multilateral arrangements that bypass the existing state-centric multilateral bodies or compete with them. I think it was James Rosnow that reminded us that we live in a messy world, a world that seems in disarray due to high levels of poverty, division, ethnic and cultural conflicts, terrorism, overpopulation, pollution, and other forms of environmental degradation. Our world is a postmodern world, for lack of a better term, one of extraordinary complexity and uncertainty as contradictory forces are unleashed by the intensification of globalization. It is a world in which integrated forces coexist alongside fragmentary ones, and homogenization is being challenged by civilizational diversity. And what is clear from my overview so far is that complex interdependence and globalization phenomenon have challenged international governance and raised the possibility of developing other forms of governance at the global level that can adequately address transnational and intermestic issues and problems. So I want to take a look now at the evolving governance structure and architecture at the global level before I end my talk. While the term global governance is relatively new, the word governance has a long tradition. And etymological searches reveal that the term can be traced back to classical Latin and Greek words for the steering of boats. Originally, the word governance therefore referred to the action or ways of managing and coordinating interdependent activities. And throughout history, there have been attempts to manage the interactions of peoples, clans, tribes, city-states, and states to ensure harmonious relations and to deal with common problems that people face. One can find examples of various forms of governance over the course of history, including empires and / imperialism, balance of power, plurilateralism, formal and informal limited purpose intergovernmental organizations, formal and informal multi-purpose international organizations, regional intergovernmental organizations, transnational and international non-governmental organizations, and embryonic global governance institutions. The form of governance labeled as empires, for example, has a long association with imperialism. This form of governance has recurred at different points in history and in many different regions of the globe. Imperialism provides the ideology underpinning this form of governance, and imperial powers exercise dominance and control over the subjugated regions they conquer. And as a result, they develop a form of governance that is based on power asymmetries, coercion, and attempts to enforce homogeneity. One can find evidence of governance by empires when you look at the Greek city-state of Athens, which was a dominant power. But this form of governance has reappeared at different junctures in history, including during our own contemporary period. And each time it has appeared, it manages to provoke resistance among those subjugated to this form of governance. Imperial powers have usually declined due in large part to their military, economic, and imperial overstretch, and also because of the resistance that comes from anti-hegemonic forces. Another prominent form of governance has been the balance of power system. This form of governance emerged after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 and the creation of the modern state system. It became the principal mechanism for maintaining international order in Europe. Underpinning the balance of power system was also another ideology, an ideology of self-preservation, particularly for those states that were predominant, and the preservation of the status quo. To accomplish these two things, great powers of the day would use the balance of power mechanism of governance to prevent the emergence of a hegemonic or imperial power and to prevent upstart powers from advancing up the hierarchical power ladder. Although diplomacy was utilized to manage the relationship between states in the Eurocentric balance of power system, at other times, balance of power governance utilized violent conflict to maintain equilibrium in the international system. War, or the threat of war, was used as a means of preserving equilibrium within the international system. Realists have described this balance of power as well as anyone else, in which independent rational actor states have had little interaction beyond their borders, and one that emphasized order and stability. By the 19th century, the balance of power form of governance gave way to a series of ad hoc and plurilateral conferences and congresses. While this form of governance was generally limited to the European state system and controlled by the big powers of the time, the members of the Council of Europe, eventually it broadened to include states in Latin America and Asia, thus expanding the scope of plurilateral multilateralism, as I like to call it. However, because the congresses and conferences were intermittent, This form of governance stopped short of establishing formal intergovernmental institutions. And in fact, by the mid-19th century, the concept of Europe became the first attempt, really, at formalizing intergovernmental organization to govern interstate relations as contact between states increased. Out of this interaction, state leaders became increasingly aware of the common problems they faced and of the need for formal institutional devices and systematic methods for regulating their behavior and relationships. This governance via formal organization and regimes was steered by the great power directorship of the concert and included such activities as regulating traffic on the great rivers of Europe, adjusting relations between belligerent and neutral states, the redivision of the Balkans, and the carving up of the African continent. However, while the great powers of the 19th century proved relatively successful in governing the subordinate states in the international system, problems arose when the dominant powers clashed among themselves. And since there was no higher power to mediate the great power conflicts, and those conflicts opened then the door for rising powers to challenge the great powers, the concept of Europe and the intermittent conferences and congress system soon became ineffective and largely irrelevant. It was Craig Murphy, I think, that recalls in the late 19th century, there were also challenges coming from this form of governance from civil society, coming to this form of governance from civil society organizations, which began to establish a presence on the global stage. Such organizations included anti-slavery movements, financial and corporate interests, as well as private associations. This parallel non-state system of governance, combined with the emerging powers beyond Europe, and a dramatic increase in the volume and scope of international activity, caused some major strains on the ad hoc conference system of the time. And in his quote puts it this way, he says, when all is said and done, the political conference system contributed more to awareness of the problems of international collaboration than to their solutions, and more to the opening up of the possibility of multilateral diplomacy than actually realizing them. But the Congress and conference system did make a significant contribution to the institutionalization of modern-day multilateralism and modern-day intergovernmental organization, because it got European governments into the habit of meeting together to discuss and iron out their problems of common concern. At the start of the 20th century, great efforts were made to establish more formal institutions of governance at the international level. International public unions began to regulate telecommunications and postal systems. Between 1860 and 1914, about 24 organizations were created to govern interstate and transnational activity. Many of them were designed to foster industry and commerce, but most were focused on meeting social and economic needs, as well as on managing a variety of conflicts stemming from the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution and the increased volume and scale of interactions between the states. But you should also note that there was a persistent presence of non-state organizations during that period, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, founded in 1919, that operated in parallel with state-centric organizations on the world stage. It took World War I to actualize the formal institutionalization of intergovernmental governance with the founding of organizations like the Permanent Court of International Justice and the League of Nations. Liberals have argued that the underlying cause of war during that First World War was the balance of powers' failure to maintain stability, order, and ultimately peace. For this reason, Woodrow Wilson and other liberals sought to replace balance of power politics with its ad hoc methods and reliance on military power and alliance politics with a formal and institutionalized system of law and conflict prevention mechanisms, including the collective security provisions that were outlined in the Covenant of the League of Nations. The League of Nations itself was an attempt to create an institutional framework to control war by eliminating or reducing states' concerns about security, the principle of collective security was seen as a remedy for the security dilemma that confronted states. As you know, a collective security system is based on a number of critical assumptions. It assumes that wars are principally the result of acts of aggression conducted by one state on another state. It also assumes that such wars could be deterred if potential aggressors knew that their actions would be met with the combined forces of all the other states within the system, either in the form of harmful sanctions or ultimately with armed force. This brings into play other assumptions, including, most importantly, the willingness of other states to respond collectively in the face of aggression. Collective security rests on the premise of shared vulnerability among states. Yet, in practice, few states were willing at that time to leave their security in the hands of the collective security instrument that was devised at the League of Nations. This was especially true for those states like Japan, Italy, and Germany, which were dissatisfied with the prevailing international order. As they sought their own solutions to interwar security issues, other states took notice and felt threatened. That's the security dilemma. So this governance system, via a multi-purpose intergovernmental organizations, the League of Nations, did not last long, as you know. The League's inability to overcome the security dilemma has been seen by many as one of the greatest failures of the interwar period, leading to the outbreak of war on the European continent in 1939. Of course, the League was not an entity unto itself, but rather it merely represented the collective will of its member states. The United States, one of the world's preeminent powers at the time, never took up membership in the League, and by the late 1930s, most of the disaffected powers, Germany, Japan, Russia, had left this international organization, and those powers that remained, principally Great Britain and France, were unwilling, for a variety of domestic and foreign policy reasons, to provide the League with the support that was needed to respond to the political, military challenges that developed in the international system during the 1930s. So beginning with Japan's attack on Manchuria, Italy's annexation of Abyssinia, and on to Germany's attack on Czechoslovakia in 1939, the League and its member governments shamefully stood by and did nothing. Yet it would be somewhat misleading to lay all the blame for World War II solely at the door of the League. For some historians, the war that began in 1939 was really a continuation of the European-wide war that had not ended in 1990, but merely paused as the combatants regained strength and armor. World War I had failed to resolve the balance of power issues that had plagued the continent since the late 19th century. States such as Germany and Italy remained dissatisfied with their place in the European power structure, and Germany especially suffered from the punitive measures imposed on it as part of the Treaty of Versailles. From the Germans' vantage point, there was much ground to recover, and added to all these was, of course, the emergence of the fascist regimes in Germany and Italy that led, respectively, to Hitler and Mussolini the rise of these two powerful men. Hitler's ambitions and expansionism posed a direct, significant challenge to Europe and the international order and to the fledgling intergovernmental governance system. In light of these factors, war became a matter of when and not a if. So with the demise of the League of Nations once World War II began, it was clear indication that the system of governance via the intergovernmental organizations needed to be reformed at the very least. So in August of 1941, just months before the US entered the war, American President Franklin Roosevelt joined with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to establish what became known as the Atlantic Charter, and that charter formed the basis for the Declaration of the United Nations, which was signed in January 1st, 1942 in San Francisco by some 26 governments. In essence, the declaration was an attempt to introduce a permanent governance system for ensuring global security once the war was over. And the victorious Allied countries were envisioned to be at the center of this new system, which in effect was expected to constitute the internationalization of the immediate post-1945 world order. In San Francisco on April 25, 1945, 2 weeks before Roosevelt's death, the United Nations system was ushered into existence on the promise that it would become not like a house of cards like the ill-fated predecessor of the League of Nations, but rather a stable and authoritative base for global tranquility and a mechanism for preserving international peace and security. The UN was supposed to be a much more powerful intergovernmental governance organization than was the League of Nations. Because whereas the League of Nations covenant made no provision for that organization to be involved in direct military action, the United Nations Charter envisioned a military staff committee to oversee military enforcement of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. And while the covenant had contemplated decisions by unanimity, the Charter pictured a majority capable of binding all members, and in some cases non-members, to its determinations. But there were many features of this governance form that was worth keeping. For example, the permanent institutional mechanisms developed within the established League of Nations were preserved with the founding of the United Nations at the tail end of World War II. So too was the multi-purpose infrastructure. Indeed, the institutionalization of the UN system was much more extensive than that of the League of Nations, because it had 6 main organs, a permanent secretariat, and subsidiary bodies, as well as large number of specialized agencies, functional commissions, regional commissions, committees, programs, funds, research and training institutes, and related and affiliated bodies. Now, the UN Charter lists several governance goals for this multi-purpose organization that went beyond the maintenance of peace and security. And they included things like developing relations among states based on respect for the principle of equal rights and the self-determination of peoples, achieving international cooperation in solving global socio-economic, cultural, and humanitarian problems, encouraging and promoting respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, and becoming the center for harmonizing the actions of nations to attain those ends. And over the years since 1945, the UN has grown in size and mandate. Its charter goals were extended to include protecting the global commons, encouraging democratization across the globe, and one can add to this recently the goal of countering terrorism that is reflected in the United Nations Security Council Resolution of 1373, and it was passed in September 28, 2001, in response to the 11 September attacks on the United States. So while the purpose of international governance on the United Nations system was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, this intergovernmental organization has mandates that go beyond simply peace and security. Economic development with the UNDP, health with the World Health Organization, communications with ITU, human rights with the Office of Human Rights, refugees, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, women, UNIFEM, children, UNICEF, etc. The United Nations retains its support of state sovereignty as exemplified in its membership, and also its resistance until recently of intervention. And of course, you know that in 2000, the United Nations made a slight inroad into this area of responsibility to protect as a new norm to try to deal with some of the humanitarian issues across the globe. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that the International Commission on Intervention of State Sovereignty, which basically tried its best to limit the reign of the responsibility to protect, to make sure that it wasn't abused by governments. You have to make the distinction between what came out of the outcome document in 2000 and what countries are now trying to label as responsibility to protect. Sometimes there's two quite different things. In essence, I want to close that by saying that the United Nations system is really a sovereignty-bound organization. It's had to find ways of accommodating non-state actors. in terms of pursuing some of the goals that it shares with those non-state actors. Elsewhere, I've spoken about the evolution of multilateralism as the intersection between bottom-up and top-down global governance. It is clear that this universal intergovernmental organization has not always been successful in addressing many of the different representational concerns of its member states. This explains the proliferation in the establishment of sometimes regional organizations and sub-regional intergovernmental organizations to try to bridge that gap. Sometimes it explains the attempts to construct alternate institutional frameworks, hybrid global governance bodies, to meet a diverse set of interests. And in some cases, these bodies are viewed as alternative to the United Nations, but of a complementary sort. And at times, they can be viewed as alternatives that challenge the legitimacy, credibility, and relevance of the United Nations. If the contemporary global agenda seems crowded by the number and scope of activities that occur in so many different sectors, the response in governance is also staggering. While the total number of governance mechanisms is seemingly countless, the variety is clearly evident. At the interstate level alone, there are numerous forms of groupings. You heard about the G2 and the G3, the G7, and sometimes the G8, depending on how Russia is behaving. The G20, the G21, the G25, the G77, the G90. These are numerous groupings that have all been created to deal and address with problems that the United Nations itself has had difficulties addressing. There are also now seemingly ubiquitous coalitions of the willing that have not been put in place, so the plurilateral arrangements that have been put in place to deal with some of these issues that the UN seems to have problems dealing with and nation states themselves cannot address on their own. Now, this all suggests that international governance consists of the output of non-hierarchical networks of interlocking international but also governmental, although not exclusively governmental, institutions, which regulate the behavior of states and other international actors in different issues of world politics. Global governance really is the output of the non-hierarchical network of international and transnational institutions, not only intergovernmental organizations and international regimes, but also transnational regimes that are regulating state behavior. In other words, global governance form international governance by suggesting that there is a case of the former, there is a decrease in the salience of states and an increase in the salience of non-states in the process of norm building, rule setting, and compliance monitoring that occurs at the global level. And this is where I think the notion of summative governance and hybrid governance comes in. I think that the time is ripe for us to start to look at a new paradigm of governance, one that's multi-level global governance, that sees global governance operating at many different levels, from the local to the global, operating on the principle of subsidiarity, something I've written about in several places. And for lack of time, I wouldn't be able to go into it in detail. But a subsidiarity principle operating underneath this form of governance, this multi-level governance, I think might be a useful way of examining this. So, to sum up, I think what we can say is that the world has gone through a series of changes, especially since the end of the Cold War, which has brought to us the importance of re-examining the international governmental structure which we have. And when you look at the empirical work on the ground, you realize that already in existence, there are governing institutions, governing bodies, governing agencies in place. Some of them are bypassing the United Nations system just to make sure that the work of governance gets done. And it's important for the United Nations to not just reform itself and tinker around the edges, but to have a serious look at transforming itself into an institution that combines sovereignty-bound and sovereignty-free actors within it. And I think this is going to be the challenge for the next 20 years or so. If the UN is not able to meet that challenge, I predict that we'll have an institution, or we'll have several different institutions that will simply bypass the organization. And we hope that that will not be the case. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. And I hope you enjoyed my few arguments here. Thank you very much.